Hello and welcome to the Tuesday, April 28th meeting of the Finance Committee. I'm Ken Shada, is of course the chairman, and per our usual practice, we are holding this meeting remotely, so I'm required to read the following statement. Pursuant to the governor's order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, General Law, Chapter 30A, Paragraph 20, as well as the Select Board's emergency order dated March 16th, 2020, the Finance Committee will be using remote participation for this meeting. The audio of this meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the town's webpage within 24 hours in accordance with the governor's emergency action requirement of keeping the public informed of actions during this meeting. I would ask that all participants remotely attending this meeting please state your name for identification purposes each time you speak throughout the meeting. At this time, I would like to take a roll call of the membership. Mr. Alfred.
Yes, and Sue's giving me vertigo, so.
Okay. Mr. Maxwell.
Sorry.
Here.
Ms. Zemer.
Here.
Mr. Sparrow.
Here.
Mr. Murphy.
Here.
Ms. Nersessian.
Here.
Okay, good. We are all here. You know, I have to say we get better attendance when we meet virtually, so this is a good thing, right? So, okay, so to get things started, just as a quick update on some administrative matters. As you guys are aware, the Select Board sent out a memo to address some of the concerns we had raised last week. I've talked to them individually throughout the week, and I think there is some level of coordination there. I wasn't, to be honest with you, I don't think the memo, I think the memo they sent out to a certain extent played down a little bit the true fiscal reality that we're seeing. So I'll leave it at that. Obviously, it's within their purview to do whatever they would like in that regard. But I think that they certainly understand why we're asking for the data we're asking for, and they have committed to providing it. They're accelerating their reviews of the departments that they oversee. They have asked me if it was okay if they could have till May 12th, because this would give them the opportunity to meet on the 11th to review more, to finish the department reviews. I said that would be okay. So I told them they could get us the data, because obviously from our perspective, we're going to meet on the 12th. So, yes, we like it on the 8th from all the other departments, and we're still holding that firm. But I gave them a little extra time given the number of departments they have to review and the number of meetings they have to do it in. So, okay. From the state's perspective, there are just a couple of things I wanted to point out.
Can I just say something about the memo?
Sure.
Yeah. No, so I think a lot of us, attended the Select Board meeting yesterday, and I think that the intention was good in that they were trying to sort of, reassure our employees, about sort of the situation and everything, that we're doing everything that we can to protect jobs and to protect as much of the budget as possible. And it was brought up about sort of our stabilization fund and everything. And I just want to reiterate sort of what you said, Ken, and just maybe put a little more emphasis on it, that this is not this golden sort of pile of cash that's just sort of sitting there on the sidelines waiting to be used. It's a very important tool, one that we've built up over the last 10 years. It's taken 10 years to get to the point where we are. And it's something that, in my opinion, but in all likelihood, if we do dip into it this year, which seems very likely, will be necessary to continue the level of service for in subsequent years, to probably dip into it again, because the state's budget and the state aid is just not going to come back as quickly as it will disappear. And I just think that that's very important for people to understand that it's not just going to be this 1 year need. And in fact, that with what we're looking at right now, based on my calculations, and granted these are just mine, not things that we haven't fully discussed, but there's not much further. If we get much more bad news, the state aid comes in and it's not down 15%, but it's down 20% or down 25%. That we may be reaching the upper bounds of what we feel comfortable using in 1 year on stabilization. So I think that while it's very important that we have this fund, and we clearly have done an incredible job. I think all towns of the board, the Select Board, FinCom, all the departments in town helping us to reach these goals. it's not this pot of money that should be viewed as there to help, sort of keep things going as we were sort of expecting 2 months ago.
Yes, and that, I think that's very important. You heard me say this last night at the select board meeting, right? Use of the stabilization fund, we all know this, maybe it's good for the public to hear. Use of the stabilization fund, by definition, creates a hole in the budget, right? Because it's replacing funds that aren't there. And so in theory, it's a bridge to when those funds return, right? And your point is exactly very well taken, which is in the last recession, local aid dropped 13% over 2 years and took 6 years after that to recover to the level that they were at prior to the recession. So that was a much less dramatic recession than we're seeing already from the shutdown of the US economy, right? So the expectation that we will see, even if the economy does a decent recovery, let's say that hypothetically everything goes best case and there's some treatment or cure or vaccine and the economy reopens and economic activity starts getting back close to where it was before. From the state's side, that does not automatically mean that local aid goes back to where it was, and in more likely case, it doesn't. And that's simply because the state is incurring costs well above what they had anticipated, like everybody is right now.
And they need to,
for example, being the unemployment compensation fund, right? Which is,
and they need to refill their rainy day fund. They're going to want to set money aside to refill that back up. You're right. The unemployment, we've almost exhausted our unemployment. I'm not sure of the exact mechanics. I know we can get a loan from the federal government to sort of refish, but I'm not sure. I mean, employees pay into that, but then when the loan has to be repaid, there could be some time there. So anyway, it's very important. We're doing everything that we can in conjunction with the select board and with all the other boards in town to preserve positions and even at this point still hours. But that certainly there's really no room for growth within the budget, and that includes salaries.
Yeah. Okay, Mr. Sparrow, you want to say something?
I think Dan's 100% right, and I agree with him about what he's saying about stabilization. But I just wanted to make two other points that I think we should. I'd like to see us sort of have a little bit of a guideline. It doesn't have to be like perfect, and I mean I realize we have a guideline document, but these are exceptional times. One of them is that. In the emails that I'm seeing with Mary and Sharon, it sounds like there might be a possibility there's a little free cash this year because we're going to hit the local receipts target, and some of the states still giving us what they promised us each month, and the receipts for the assessment are still coming in. And I'm not saying we should do anything in particular with it, but I think we should think about if there is money, even if it's $50,000, we should sort of have an idea of what should be done with it and thinking about it now, because, we just want to make sure that we're thinking about the future and we're not just going to pounce on it to do whatever pet project we're thinking about. And the other piece to add to that is I think we need to think about capital as well. I forget the exact number. I mean, it's $5 or $6 million in that capital account. Are we going to use it towards the water treatment plant? What are we thinking about? I think, we as a group should have some ideas and guidelines and some thoughts about it, because in the absence of those guidelines, I think everybody kind of has lots of ideas, as I've certainly heard those bandied about by other boards in town. So I think we should have some framework to think about some of those other funds that we have for reserves and what we want to do in the near and long term with those monies. So,
yeah, no, that's a very good point. And we'll get to that in a minute, because I think we do want to have a discussion. There are a couple of things I think we'd like to clarify, or we should clarify, that I will then put, once we discuss them and come to a consensus, I'll put them in an email to send for distribution. There have been a couple of things that I've gotten related to that. First of all, the one thing I'll say on the free cash side is if we have to dip into stabilization to make the budget whole right now, that my priority would be that if we have free cash, we replenish that, right? Because we might need it in the future. But that's a discussion we can have when we see what
But also, I think that our anticipation for free cash also may, as we make decisions, allow us to sort of maybe cut back on our capital set aside a little bit, knowing that we may have some free cash at the end that we can make up in the hole for that too. So, I don't want to say that we're going to budget with it and use it free cash for operating stuff, but if you have a little to play with in order to minimize how much we actually take out of stabilization, we may be able to take the capital set aside down some if we also think that there's some projects that could be deferred, right? That we don't necessarily need to be done right this year. But again, these are things that we all need to sort of talk about.
Yeah. So the other thing that I was going to say was relative to the memo we sent out. A couple of people, the question has been asked about. So let me start with that because that ties into everything we're discussing. Okay, first is I have Mary came back and said, which pay table do you want to use? And I said use the FY20 pay table for that's 0%, right? The FY21 reflected our guideline. Get rid of that. So she's told all department heads preparing the new budgets to say use the FY20 pay scale. Okay, so that was taken care of, and I just wanted to make sure everybody was. I was certain that was our intent, but I just wanted to point that out there. If you don't agree with me, say that right now. The other thing was with regards to the department head adjustments that were made last year. We've had the discussion, and we had the discussion a while ago before the pandemic about how we treat those. And the presumption and what we had come to the conclusion at that point, a couple of months ago was no increases, but annualization of their salary that was implemented. In other words, we wouldn't give them raises, but if they, since the adjustments were made during the fiscal year, we were going to reflect the new pay rate for the entire year, and that was it, with no further additional funds. So the question is that still the case with this? Because that was Mary's other question, was what do you want to do about department head salaries? I said my presumption is that's the equivalent of zero, right? We have the issue with how that whole thing came about, but we had repeatedly said that, well, we're going to have that discussion when we have a town meeting, but with the residents to make sure they understood that the process didn't work the way we expected it to, but that we weren't going to work to penalize the employees per se. So I don't know.
Ken, if I could.
Go ahead, Mr. Alfred.
So look, we all know where I stand on this. I hate this, and then but I'm not gonna delve into that right now. And just to be clear, I will be voting against all line item transfers for this. But I think that look, we've all voted, so I'm fine holding it as we have it now, and in technically seeing increases in those line items year over year. However, I would just say that if things do get worse and we do actually start having to look back on cutting back on hours and cutting back on employee costs, and certainly if we did any kind of furloughs or anything like that, I think that before we do that, we actually roll those back to zero and level fund those line items before we start cutting hours of other employees. We're not there yet. I don't want anyone listening to this to think that we're now starting to think about cuts and things like that. All I would say is that because we aren't there yet, but if it does come to that, I think that the first move we should do is to roll those back to be flat cost year over year, which I realize would result in a decline in their weekly or biweekly paychecks, but that would be the first move before we take other employees and we cut their hours back. Yeah, well,
if we got to that point, we'd have that discussion further, right?
Right.
But so for now is yes. Go ahead, Sue.
So this is Sue. I do think, to Dan's point, I think that the select board should be doing scenario planning right now. I think given where we are and the trending that continues to go down, I think it would be incredibly beneficial to understand if this happens, here are the options, here's the cost savings, et cetera. Because we're seeing in a lot of organizations where management is taking a pay cut to save other positions. And I think that scenario planning should be happening. And so that would be one option. Cutting positions might be an option. I just think that should be happening at this point, so that as we continue down the path, if things continue to decline, then there are different things that we can at least look at, and that the select board is considered.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can certainly convey that to them. I mean, I think we all agree that if the situation continues to deteriorate, that they should have they should be planning now for a potential deterioration. But to my original point, so from Mary's, for the guidance of the memo, I will tell her to assume for the moment that they're just 0% annualized is what they were making, what their annualized rate would have been in
So,
FY.
to clarify, just so we're all in the same boat, when you say annualized, are you saying they got a raise? Is it, let's say they were going up and it was going to be $1,000 from a 50,000, so now 51,000, or is it because we came halfway through the year, they're only going to get $750 or $500 increase?
No, what I mean is I look at it from a rate perspective, right?
Yep.
If you were being paid, let's say, I'll pick round numbers just to make it easy,
Sure.
right? $10,000 a month, or let's say $5,000 a month prior to the adjustment, then you got raised to $10,000 a month. You didn't do that, just for the record. Nobody got that. But what I'm saying is at $5,000 a month, their salary would have been $60,000 a year. At $10,000, it's $120. So but in FY20, they got somewhere between the two because the raise kicked in. So I'm saying they would get $120 in FY21, which is the annualized rate they're making now.
That's what I understood. I just want to make sure everybody's on board and understands so we don't get any pushback.
To be clear, I don't like it. I've been very clear about that.
Yeah.
But I at this point, there are so many other things that we're dealing with that I'm not going to fight that fight on this again. We've already the finance committee's already decided to sort of go forward with this. Is how they want to go forward with it.
I don't think any of us liked it.
The
I was going to say, I
expectation,
don't think we like the process at all. So
they want to do,
vocal in my dislike for it.
the select board wants to do a transfer, a line item transfer, instead of going on a warrant. Just an FYI.
yes, and that was going to be something I was going to mention, right? I had the finance team meeting tonight before our meeting, and that was raised about these line item transfers coming our way. And I said, there's a process issue here as well, right? So what I said was, look, from the finance committee's perspective, we made it clear that we were not happy with the way the process unfolded that resulted in these adjustments, right? And I said we were, I said some of the members, again, we haven't formally voted this because there's no need to, but I said, several members of the committee wanted to make comments at town meeting about it as citizens, not even as FinCom members necessarily. And they have the right to do that at town meeting. And I said, the line item transfer for FY20 is one matter we will debate when we get the transfer forms. We'll decide what to do. They point, Jeff pointed out that, hey, they're contracts here, right? So we've signed employment contracts for FY20 with these people, so we have to honor the contracts. We should make sure we have the money to pay them. Again, that's another discussion, but that's their philosophy.
So the contract or not, this is something that should be done at town meeting. I will be voting against every single one of these line item transfers because they should go to town meeting, and we should not be using a crisis to skirt town meeting, as we tried to use some sort of subterfuge in the fall to skirt town meeting, then realized that we actually needed to go to town meeting to deal with this, and are now using a crisis and sort of these executive powers that are put on us by the state, because we're not only because now we're in our sort of our special sort of powers period, but also because town meeting has been delayed.
Right. So just to be clear, though, I just want to clarify that, Dan. The line item transfer and the power we have to approve those is independent of the crisis, and that we're not in that time yet. It kicks in May 1.
But we could very easily say, in a normal period where we had 7 days to go to town meeting before our powers kicked in, we say, nope, we're going to go to town meeting. Now We're looking at middle of June at the earliest to have town meeting, and so it's a little bit more like they're forcing us against. I think we vote these down and we let the select board figure out how to deal with it. And then we go to town meeting, and town meeting can figure it out. Yeah. That's just that. Well, whenever we go to town meeting, and in the interim, they deal with it. This is we're not using a crisis to subvert, the town meeting process here. That's just complete bull.
Right, and I will say two things on that. One is we'll have that detailed debate when we get the transfers, right? So we have nothing to debate right now. I'm just telling you what is likely to be coming. Okay. The second part is with regards to town meeting, the select board meeting, right? There's concern about the June 15th date, given a couple of things, right? The current state of the virus and when the economy will reopen. whether we will be in a situation where we can have a town meeting, meaning even if things reopen in May or late May, can we have a gathering of, a couple hundred people in an auditorium?
To that point, Ken,
I know I know you want to say something, Dan. Let me finish and I'll get to you. Okay.
Yeah.
So the two things I have conveyed, and one of the other unknowns here is, what is local aid going to look like, right? We don't even have a governor's budget yet. So when we see the first inkling of a budget from the state, which may not be until July, right? That's when we'll have more confidence, in the sense that, we're building in a 10% or 15% local aid. Right? If they come in and say, here's our plan, we're only going to cut it, 8% this year or something, then that changes our budget picture a little bit, right? But I agree with you entirely about one aspect of this, which is, to me, we don't use the crisis as an excuse to remove the voice of the residents from the budget process, right? I understand that we may need to move town meeting out into July if the conditions warrant, and then we have to go to interim budgeting. But to me, the overriding objective of the town and the town's executives should be to hold a town meeting and to work towards having a town meeting in some fashion that allows the town to get as close to the normal process as possible. With that regard, I will point out that currently there are laws, just like we had to get the modified open meeting law for this meeting, there are laws that govern town meeting that would need to be modified. And to that end, I actually did email Pooja yesterday and said, she had asked me for feedback on municipal issues, and I sent her an email saying, my concern is that as we hear more and more talk about social distancing going on for a much longer time period, even if the economy reopens, that will preclude large gatherings for quite a long time. So I said, my advice would be, if they're not already considering this, which they may be, I just haven't heard, is to have to advise our senator and legislator that we really should be thinking about modifying town meeting laws in a way that allows us to have an appropriately safe town meeting, rather than just saying we push out until we can have this traditional town meeting, because that may not be, theoretically could be a year, and we don't want to operate on an entire year of interim budgets where the town has no input. So to that end, Mr. Alfred, I know you want to say something on that as well.
This morning I sent, after hearing what the select board said, and look, the concerns are genuine. I sent them an email just suggesting that we look for creative alternative ways of still maintaining any orders that are coming out from the state. Obviously, this moment in time, we could not have the town meeting at all, because you can't meet in groups of more than 10 people. That just makes it unfeasible. But if we do start to loosen up and they do start to allow for smaller, larger groups, one idea I had is that we put 50 to 75 people in the auditorium, very well spaced apart, and then open up other classrooms as sort of these, annex rooms with TVs on, and vote counters and runners and ways of signaling to the head if there's a question, and the person then going to the auditorium to ask the question. Everyone's still within the high school, and all votes counted, so we're all sort of in one place. I talked to somebody else who actually mentioned maybe even opening up the gymnasium, which is much larger, and you could maybe get more people in there and more spaced out. And I think that, it is an imperative that we don't try to just sort of say, this is too difficult, we don't want to hold a town meeting, that we need to do everything possible to look for safe and creative ways to hold town meeting.
I agree.
So
I even suggested we use Comedian, by the way. Somebody said we should have an outdoor town meeting and use Comedian.
Well, you could, on the weekends, you could have an outdoor town meeting. I even heard someone talking about the people that are considering doing things at movie drive-ins and things, but I don't think we have one of those in town. And I'm not sure.
You have to go to Mendon, I think, is the closest drive-in.
I don't think anyone wants to drive to Mendon, but the outdoor is much better. So having some sort of outdoor town meeting is possible, where people can stand and sit far apart. We can get creative here, and there are ways of dealing with it and still letting the people hear and be heard, and getting a town meeting approved budget passed, even if it's just a 1/12 budget or some sort of interim budget or something like that. Where we can sort of all get together.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Any other comments on?
further encourage that.
I presume there's been discussions with other towns as to how they're sort of thinking about it and planning and getting ideas so that there's, brainstorming going on. Dan, I love your suggestions, all of them. I think they're all great. But hopefully there's a lot of discussions with other towns too, just to see if there's other ideas as well.
Sure, but we should be brainstorming everything and talking to everybody about different
Agreed.
ways of dealing with it. I don't know if there's a system. Maybe one town has some sort of remote voting type of thing, which still within a location, right? We could use, and maybe we could share them and disinfect them all. Obviously, opening up more rooms in the high school opens up other problems, and we need to get the administration of the school on board because there'd be increased cleaning costs and all that. But look, I mean,
Right.
we just need to we rather than thinking, okay, this is difficult, we just shouldn't, and the state has said we don't need to hold town meeting, so we're not going to, and we're just going to use these special powers. I think that's which is sort of, and I don't want to put words into the select board's mouths or anything, but it sort of felt to me sort of how they were kind of looking at it, and I could be completely wrong, but I just think that we need to be working as hard as possible to find a solution. Now, we don't know what, June 15th, the rules of the road are going to be. It could be that they still are exactly the same as we are right now, in which case holding a town meeting would be impossible. I mean, unless we were to go virtual, like, right? And that seems, we should still do it, but it seems very difficult.
Ken?
Yes, Ms. Zimmer, go ahead.
Michelle Zimmer. Linda Marshall is here. That's Linda's iPad. Linda Marshall from the Senior Center. And I think it's important to get the senior population to get their input too, because there's, we're doing more and more remoting, but I think that a lot of seniors don't have access to that technology. So I think it's important. I mean, Dan's ideas don't involve technology, but I think a lot of other options do involve technology, and it's important to get input from senior population. I think we can't forget that.
Yeah, and just to be clear, right? This is really us talking about what the select board should be doing, right? We're not in charge of putting together a town meeting. So
but just us saying how important town meeting is to hold, and that we want to just make that publicly known and the select board aware.
Absolutely.
Maybe we could use the Chromebooks somehow too. No, I'm actually not kidding. I mean, we take those all back, right? I mean, from the students, we could get them all back and then redeploy them. There's enough of them if we needed to, if we need to deploy technology for some reason.
Right, and I would say though that remains to be seen, right? Because one of the discussions I know that is taking place is whether they do that, because obviously seniors have to return their Chromebooks, but given that returning them means cleaning them and everything else now, there may be a desire to just say to the kids, hold on to it and bring it back in the fall.
High school seniors.
Right. High school seniors, right? not senior citizens, high school seniors, right? So yes.
Anyway,
no,
I think
agree.
I think those are all. Everybody has good ideas, and I think brainstorming, what could work. I think to Dan's point is really great. I think that's what we should all be thinking. Not we, but the select board should be thinking about and how to make it work.
In school parlance, we should be using growth mindset rather than
I see the virtuous cycle of growth. Is that what you're going to start calling?
No, we can't. We don't have a way of solving the town meeting problem yet.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So okay. So other topics that I wanted to mention was one. I went to that department. I sent you guys the invite to that Department of Revenue, whatever they wanted to call it, summit thing last week. I did attend. It wasn't really, I wouldn't say it was revolutionary, what I heard, right? It was really a lot of individual town financial leaders talking to the DOR about what they're going to let us get away with. I mean, to put it bluntly, like, can we do this? Can we do that? Can we do this now that, the crisis? So there is going to be a recording of that made available, and it was an hour long. It was fixed at an hour. So, if you have an hour you want to kill, you can certainly watch it. But the one thing that I took out of it that I wanted to make sure I shared with the committee was this. The way the federal government has structured the reimbursement for pandemic-related expenses, they cannot be budgeted for FY21. Okay, so, and that's a big thing, right? We can't look at, let's say, hypothetically, let's say we looked at the EMS budget, the emergency management budget, and we said, okay, we're going to need, $100,000 for PPE in this year because of the crisis, so we're going to increase that budget, right? When we do that, that makes it non-reimbursable from the federal government. And the reason for that is kind of a twisted logic. It makes some sense, but then doesn't really make a ton of sense, which is the intention was really, if you look at FY20, right, and you had a budget going into FY20, clearly nobody sat last year at this time and said, let's pass a budget anticipating a COVID pandemic in late in the fiscal year, right? So for those expenses that were incurred as a result of the pandemic, they're obvious, right? You have more cleanings, you have more PPE, whatever. Those are things that you know, and we've talked about this before, about the expenses that the town is incurring to under the new normal, so to speak. Those are clearly not budgeted expenses, and they're very easy to show that they were not budgeted expenses. However, that the federal government didn't want people coming back and saying, let's say that, I'll make up another case. Let's say that as part of our normal operating procedure at the police station, we clean the cars once a month, right? We haven't cleaned out once a month, right? And now we sit there and we say, okay, well, now I've got this COVID crisis. So now that once a month cleaning that we had in our budget, now we're going to bill the government for it because now we can claim it was COVID to keep our cars clean, right? So the government says, no. That was your normal cleaning. We're not going to allow you to stick that under pandemic response when you were planning on doing that anyway, right? So that's why they have that provision. Now, for something like FY20, it makes perfect sense when you didn't anticipate the pandemic. For FY21, it seems totally illogical because good budgeting would say you take into account the information you have available to you at the time you make the budget, right? So you would think that our goal should be, okay, if we know right now that the emergency management budget is going to need 50 grand more to deal with the crisis, that we build that into our planning, right? But if we do that, then the government looks at that and says, well, you planned that, so we're not paying for it. So the DOR's guidance was, don't put anything in FY21 budgets that is related to the pandemic. Now, my feeling is what you expressed last week, Dan, which is what I think we will end up doing. I think what we should do is when we finish the budget blueprint, we bolster the reserve fund by a substantial amount through whatever means, either from a stabilization fund or from reworking the budgets elsewhere. And then throughout the year, as we pay, as we deal with pandemic-related expenses, we pay those from the reserve fund so that we can document those as the extraordinary expenses that they are. So,
to be fair, I think probably what they were thinking was that they didn't want to pay for something that the towns could otherwise afford themselves.
Right.
So that if you can afford $50,000 extra for your emergency response, then the government shouldn't be reimbursing you for it because you don't need it. It would be my guess. And yeah, there's a little perverse thinking there, but they don't want towns that do have a lot of extra money, probably.
Right. So my point was just that when we start putting this FY21 budget together, we just want to keep that in mind. We don't want to look at it and say, okay, let's jack up, police or fire or ambulance or whatever in response to the pandemic. We want to make sure we treat them as though there's no pandemic, and then we have a separate amount of money we use to pay the pandemic related expenses. Avoid triggering that rule. The last kind of administrative thing that I wanted to relay to the committee was on the minutes side. I did, we talked about some of the town employees who are otherwise less than fully engaged right now. Two of them have stepped forward and said they will catch us up on minutes. So I got them started this morning. I sent them Ben's spreadsheet with instructions and talked to one of them, and they're going to be catching up on our backlog. At the same time, just literally almost in a comical coincidence, we got a records request for minutes for our latest meetings from the months of March and April. So we're going to, obviously I told them to prioritize those first so we could respond to the records request in a timely manner. So expect to see those minutes, whenever they get around to them. But we do have that request outstanding, and I'm working with the townspeople, the town employees, to make sure that it's handled the right way, because the request came to me, but I'm not the town's records officer. So I handed it to the select board and said, I don't know, we have to by law have I think it's called a record access officer. And I believe, I'm fairly certain that's the town clerk, but I don't know what the select board did when they had to appoint one. or when they had to name one. But that's the person who should be, who's the official servicer of the request, so to speak. So I'll be working with them to make sure we get the stuff. But from the minutes perspective, we should be catching up on our backlog. So,
but that's great, and really appreciate those employees stepping up. And I think it's important that the people of Holliston realize that that everyone is looking for every way to utilize the resources that we have, and that our hardworking employees are stepping up and are offering to do something that's not necessarily in their job, but if they have time that they're willing to sort of, and they're being paid for it. This is not volunteer. They're still
yes, but just to be clear, they're not getting paid any extra for it. Right?
They're not being paid extra, but it's not part of their job description or part of their normal job responsibilities, right, which in some cases have to manage. So it's great to see and great that people step forward for that.
Yeah. Okay.
Is there a way to see or to get, and I don't know who would have this, but how many employees are working remotely versus not?
Certainly between Chris and Mary, they could probably, because Chris knows who got laptops. And so if there are employees that are not set up to work remotely, he's going to know that, right?
Okay.
I will say that there was one of the things that was brought up, which I didn't think we needed to talk about tonight, but was if this continues, like let's say there's a flare up in the fall, right? If we ease distancing and then there's another, it's seasonal and it comes back in the fall, do we want to make sure that as part of our kind of planning for that reserve to pay for COVID expenses, that we might include in that reserve, thinking about, okay, well, how many more laptops would it need for the handful of employees that may not have them right now, so that if there is a further flare-up, we could make sure every employee was working remotely.
Well, I think we're going to need to do that, and we don't want it to be so substantial that it really hurts other budgets. But we need to do that, and then also in conjunction with the schools for potential needs they may have.
Impacts to the schools. Yeah,
if schools can't reopen. I mean, that's not something we necessarily want to move into their budget or anything, just because if it doesn't materialize,
yeah.
But we also don't want to force them to have to budget for all of that too, because that would only make the sort of the effective decline in their budget even greater.
Right.
Well, I think that's Ken. Sorry, I think that gets back to Ken's point, is that we have sort of ongoing normal budgeting that takes place as if we in a normal situation, and then we've got sort of the COVID related costs, and that would be in the COVID related costs. If you can't open, here's how we deal with it. So it's not a.
Would Chromebooks be something that if needed for remote work that we could build, that the federal aid is intended for?
Well,
for the response for PPE and extra hours for ambulance, fire, police, and things like that.
That I don't know, right? I'm not going to claim to be an expert in whatever they put in the CARES Act or the way they're handling the reimbursement.
We should find out then. We should see exactly what the scope of that is. My guess
regardless, Dan, just to be clear, even if they're not reimbursing it, I think we do want to keep those separate, right? Even if the town makes an expense, we don't get reimbursed. We are going to want to know, okay, how much did this response cost us at the end, and so forth. So, yeah. Okay. So with that in mind, let's start talking budget. We has anybody? I'll just give you a couple of thoughts. I'm still trying to figure out how we get to something that looks balanced. I think that just to tell you some of the things I've been looking into in the last week. Obviously, we've talked about the possibility of using the stabilization fund. I'm trying to use that as the last step of the process. There are things I looked at the overlay, at our run rate on the overlay, to see if we could cut back our overlay a tiny bit. I think there may be at most 50 grand there if we're lucky. It looks like we're running close on that. We've obviously talked about the capital set aside. I do know that the select board I don't think they did this yesterday. In fact, they didn't do it yesterday. I was at the meeting, but I think in the coming weeks, they are going to be looking at paring back the warrant to only those essential things, as we kind of had asked them to look at, and they themselves had said they were going to look at, but they haven't started the process. I think Jeff is now kind of formally planning to go to the select board and say, here's my recommendation as to what we should get rid of in the warrant.
He already did that.
Yeah. Well, he
was
did,
clear when we went through the warrant last time. He was very clear and articulate during the meeting to say, I'm recommending this gets pulled. I'm recommending this gets pulled. I'm recommending this gets pulled. So he was really clear.
Yeah.
I don't think
So
it
the select board has
expressed
to
that
act
to
on
the,
it.
I don't think it expressed that to the select board though. I think it was just amongst us.
No.
No, it was-
Someone from the select board was I think,
John.
wasn't it Mr.
It was John.
Yeah, John was going through the warrant and Jeff was piping in on all of them or
But-
on a number of them. Sorry. Take it
Yeah,
back
but I
now.
don't think he formally did it to the whole board. I think it was just us and John was there. So I haven't
I
seen
think-
him do
I think
that
he
during
has-
any meeting.
I think he has since provided, and because to be honest with you, part of the reason that stalled was because there was a lack of clarity on what he could actually suggest for redlining, right? Because, for example, he was suggesting pulling out the school capital request, and the school committee's stance was that's not his to pull out, right? He can pull out. So I know there was some back and forth, not involving us, involving the school committee and the select board in terms of how to handle school projects. So I know Jeff was going to go back to the drawing board and basically update his red line suggestions with what he felt the select board should pull out. I believe he has now done that and given that to the board, although I'm not sure, but they'll obviously be taking it up soon. So we should have some ideas to where they're going on the warrant. There is one piece of good news I will deliver about that. We talked last week about a couple of things we think we're going to have to fund regardless, one of them being the environmental cleanup issue at Woodland Street. They got the bids for that last week for that work, and the bids came in substantially lower than what Jeff had anticipated. So, we were talking about $100,000, and it looks like it may be 50 at most, going forward. So, in a sense, that's good. That's $50,000 we won't have to spend on that when the time comes. The other thing that I wanted to point out was also we have our snow and ice overage that we build into the budget every year. We could take the approach that we're going to remove that. We haven't really, in essence, needed it in several years because we've had enough left in the reserve fund to pay off any snow and ice deficit without having to tap that allocated money. So, we could potentially eliminate that on paper and say, okay, well, if we have a snow and ice deficit, we'll just deal with it when it comes, next winter, right? Obviously, I have to get from Sharon and Reed on where we are now because, as you know, we were spending a lot early in the winter when we had a bunch of those little storms early, and then it kind of, as you know, the winter fizzled out. So I asked her recently to get me an updated number to see whether we really did go over, and if we did, how much, because that I doubt we went over by a substantial enough amount that we would have to, we wouldn't be able to cover it with what's existing in the reserve fund for FY20.
Except for the nice 4 inches we got last weekend, right?
Yeah, but I don't even think they sent the trucks out last weekend. I didn't hear anything.
But I would have been shocked if they didn't send something out. I think I saw plows and sanders. I don't know if they were plowing, but they.
Okay, because I was gonna say I didn't hear anything go by my house, so maybe they just didn't care about my street. So, but anyway, so that's the kind of thing I'm thinking. I think that we will start to see budgets coming in over the next couple of weeks. I think we do want to give it a little more time to try to get what I don't know yet. I will say with almost certainty we will not see an approved state budget before July. With what's going on in the pandemic, I don't see any way that this becomes a legislative priority in the short term, right? However, I do believe that we will see a budget blueprint at some point soon. And I'm not saying soon like tomorrow, I'm saying soon like sometime in the month of May. So with that in mind, I think that we want to, I wanted to get feelings. Do we want to just keep looking at the model and thinking about options and then wait until we see the first cut of what the governor presents? Because that'll at least give us a ballpark for where we think the state's going budget-wise, or what's the feeling?
I'm not sure what choice we have other than to do that, because once you do that, you can start sort of layering in the other pieces and some of the things that we do sort of quote unquote control, or at least kind of have a better idea of budgeting for ourselves, local receipts and things like that. But before you have that number, which really, in my opinion, could be anywhere from -25 to -10. I mean, how do you possibly really sort of figure out what we're looking at?
I missed when we thought that might be coming.
Well, we don't know. I'm just making a guess that the way that the process traditionally works is after that, the Council of Elders meeting, as I call it, the governor's budget typically follows a month after that. Okay. So they meet, the Council of Elders meets in like mid-December, and you get the governor's budget beginning of January, early January or mid-January. So obviously the governor's a little bit preoccupied. So I don't know, but that's why I said this Council on Elders meeting was what, the 14th. So if you use the typical timeline, that we'd be looking at, mid-May for a governor's budget. So maybe a little later than that. I think that realistically, look, in my opinion, if we don't have anything from the state by mid-May, then town meeting will be delayed again, regardless of the situation, right? Because even if the restrictions are easing a little bit and we could potentially meet in mid-June, I think that Mr. Cronin has expressed this to me in a meeting I had with him this morning. He basically said, look, if any budget we'd be coming up with without any input from the state, at least a governor's blueprint, would be just such a shot in the dark. It wouldn't be worth having a town meeting, right? So that's why I'm saying, like, my expectation is if we don't get a governor's budget in the next month, then town meeting will push out a little further.
Is that something that like Pooja would have an insight to because of her contacts, or?
Well, I can certainly ask her, right? She's Karen Spilka's office manager, basically, and it's chief of staff. So I can ask her what the time. She told me when I talked to her last time about 3 weeks ago that she didn't expect the Senate to really get into the budget until kind of June at the earliest, right? And that's, again, that was 3 weeks ago when we were looking at the surge and everything. Things will change rapidly, right? If things start steadying very quickly and the situation looks like we're past the peak, right? Then I think that the need for them to feel like they have to be compelled to work on COVID legislation every day, maybe they have more time for the budget and the schedule changes. So the other aspect of this, though, is if we go down this road, and I'm fine with it, but one thing I think we should start thinking about over the next couple of weeks is an interim budget, right? We have this law right now that says that it has to be no less than 1/12 for every department. So we could take the approach of, okay, every department just gets 1/12 of FY20, and that's our recommendation to the select board. But I do think that we want to start having that discussion amongst ourselves, because it's ultimately the select board that approves the interim budgets. But they have stated publicly, and Mr. Cronin and others on the board have stated to me that obviously they would want our input on it, on what they should recommend as an interim budget. So I would propose, I want to make sure that we at least have that discussion if we think that an interim budget will be necessary for a month or two. So,
meaning that you can't go less than what you have currently, and
no, you can't. You're correct. You can't go less than 1/12 of what you currently have in FY20. So it basically guarantees 0%.
Right.
Okay. So, Mr. Sparrow, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, two things. I think the first thing is I heard today, I think it was on NPR, they were saying that one of the things they were looking at in the state is they have to figure out how does the House and the Senate in Boston meet under these circumstances as well, given everything. So they were trying to figure out some of that stuff. So until they figure out some of that logistics, they would, we have to wait for that to be able to see what's, for them to be able to put together, to pass a budget, and how do they do all that stuff as well. And then the second thing is I think we can, kind of getting to what I was saying before, I think maybe this could give us an opportunity, even if we don't have the specifics, because, we need to start getting budgets from people and things like that to be able to start, weighing where things go. But I mean, some of the stuff that we had talked about in our document was things like, particular budgets that are important to the present crisis, and how do we handle it. And I think it might be a reasonable exercise for us to sort of go through that and sort of say, like, okay, what do we know? What do we, and especially as the budgets come in, so we can start to have an understanding of, like, where we want things to go, how we can move things around a little bit so we can, when we get them, because it seems like, the timeline might be fairly compressed. I mean, we might not have a lot of time, if we do get revenue numbers, I'm making it up, on, June 1st, we move town meeting to July 1st. I'm totally making numbers up here. We might not have enough time to really start weighing and putting things together. And it might be a good exercise, even if we don't put numbers attached to these things, to at least have a framework and understanding of where we want to go and how things should move, so we can pull the trigger quickly and we're not trying to scramble to make something happen that we're not happy about or satisfied with in the end.
Right. Yes, go ahead, Mr. Alfred.
The 112 budget, is that at the total budget level, or is that at a department level? Just out of curiosity.
I believe it's at a department level. I'll double check the law, but when I read the law in its original, I read the bill, so I didn't see what the final law said, but the bill that I was handed said that each department, each budget had to be funded at 1/12 of what it had, no less than 1/12 of what it had in FY20.
So what I think would be helpful for both us and then the select board as well would be to get from Sharon what our July and August sort of spending is at a department level, has been or was last year. Just so we kind of know, because there may be departments that spend significantly more within July and August. And need to be funded higher, and this sort of ties into whether it's at a department level or at a holistic budget level. Because at a holistic budget or a department level, then we're going to have to fund everyone flat, except for some departments that actually are going to need more, which then obviously requires us to sort of put more money aside. But it's just important to know.
Right, because I think we pay insurance up front in order to get a big discount, don't we?
Yeah, and you guys are hitting on the objection I had to the law when it was presented to me for comment. I gave that feedback exactly, which is there are budgets that don't require 1/12, and we shouldn't be forced to fund them 1/12 for that very reason. You're right, going higher is fine. The state says you can make it as high as you want. But let's say hypothetically that payment that we make once a year is due in December, right? Well, there's no need to fund that line item at 1/12 in July and August if we know the payment's not going to be needed for 6 months, that kind of thing. So Mr. Sproul, you got a comment?
Yeah, the comment that I had is I think we have to be careful too about the timing of income too, to make sure we have the liquidity to make those payments. Especially if the schools, if like we're getting the entire 12th of the school's budget in the middle of the summer, where the summer funding is lower, we got to make sure that the money is there so we can actually make those payments.
Right, and the other thing is just to keep in mind that a 1/12 appropriation doesn't mean they have to spend it, right? We Dan and Michelle and I have, in our conversations with the budget subcommittee of the school committee, have mentioned this and asked them, like, what does your 1/12 budget look? What does your budget look like in terms of run rate in July and August when school's not in session? And obviously, there are expenses, but their run rate tends to be lower, and they said that. So their comment to us was, if we had a 1/12 budget, we probably wouldn't spend it. We would work to not spend it all, right? Because we'd have to appropriate that, but they wouldn't have to spend it all. It's a dangerous game because you really don't want to be in that situation in general of saying, okay, we're going to allow you to spend more than we think you need because the law is making us do that. But we're going to ask you not to spend more than you need just to be, out of the goodness of your heart, right? Now, obviously, they're going to work in, any department head, I think, would work to only spend what they need to if they understood, which they all do, understand the fiscal situation. But that's why I didn't like the idea of a 1/12 budget, right? The towns know which budgets, the reason for that was primarily for job security, right? Because by forcing towns and departments to budget 1/12, it basically says you're going to keep people employed. And I think that's the lever they want to take away, was in this crisis, they don't want to encourage municipalities to let people go. But I just don't think that's a smart way of doing it, right? You could have the law say you can't fire anybody.
Or
right?
You have to fund at 1/12 all employee line items.
Right, or something like that, yeah. So, but anyway, so at this point, I think we're pretty much in data gathering mode. We'll wait and see what happens with the state. I'll try to get some more info, see if Pooja's got any updates on timelines for the state or the governor. The funny thing is that a lot of this is statutory under ordinary circumstances. The governor's budget, the reason he gets it in mid-January is because there's a law that says somewhere on the books in Massachusetts says he's got to present a budget for approval by, the third Monday in January or something like that, right? So now you face this crisis, and it's like technically he met the law because he submitted the budget back in January. Now it's being redone. So are they applying those same constraints? Does he have a time limit from when the town council of elders met? I have no idea. And that's what if those still apply, then we're definitely going to see a governor's budget next month. So, okay. Does anybody have any other comment on the budget? Yes, Ms. Zemer.
I just want to say that Linda was going to present some information about Council on Aging and Senior Center. I just don't want to forget.
I will get to that. I will get that in a minute. I just want to make sure so we're done with the budget discussion because I don't know. Yes, go ahead, Sue.
Sorry, just on the warrant, what Jeff sent out the other day still has the school capital in there, like the field is in there. What do you have a sense of when they're going to go through and at least for capital items relook at what the needs are going forward?
You mean the schools?
Yes.
Yes, that's kind of on their radar. We're meeting with them. We're having a liaison meeting tomorrow, so I'll ask them tomorrow morning when we talk to them what the exact time. Last time, you got to keep in mind, last time we talked to them was the morning that we feel was basically, we just found out the school is canceled for the remainder of the year. So because of that, they kind of said, okay, now that we know this and it's official, we have a whole bunch of planning to do. We have a whole bunch of things to consider. And, we're going to, so they said, give us a week to figure out the timeline for getting all this stuff done.
Okay.
So I should get an answer for you tomorrow. Okay. So anything else on the budget side of things? We're just kind of waiting and see at this point. Okay. If that's the case, then Linda, you wanted to talk to us about what's going on at the Senior Center. Go ahead and unmute yourself first.
Hello?
Yep, there you go.
Okay, good. Linda Marshall, Director of the Senior Center. So we have a couple of unique things with the Senior Center, and when you talk about keeping all staff on with July 1st, our van drivers are actually not paid for with town funds. The primary funding for that is monies we receive from the MWRTA, but because our ridership is down, we're not getting the same amount of funds that we would normally get. So although between that money I have there and what we have in the van account, I can continue to pay our part-time drivers through the end of the fiscal year. I'm not going to be able to do that come July 1st. We still are providing some essential transportation for essential medical appointments to make sure people do have the food that they need, pharmacy, that type of thing. My drivers are also delivering meals that are prepared at the Senior Center to seniors every Monday and Wednesday. So we have about 45 seniors that we're delivering to. So there's definitely some real work being done. Our full-time driver has also been doing some actually administrative tasks for us as well, which is very much appreciated. We also have found that we have some expenses that we don't ordinarily have because of the meal program. Usually our meals are at the Senior Center. We use real dishes, real silverware, etc. Now we're having to purchase appropriate containers to deliver the meals twice a week. So we've already spent about $500 on supplies to do that and anticipate spending about another $500 before the end of the fiscal year. Normally supplies come out of our supply line item, the budget, but currently with that being on hold, we have been using our formula grant funds. I will also run out of those before the end of the fiscal year and we'll move into our nutrition revolving account to be able to continue the lunch program through the end of this fiscal year. We've already heard from Elder Affairs to anticipate a minimum $1 to $2 decrease per senior in funding in the next fiscal year because of the same things that you're talking about, that nobody really knows what the money is going to look like in fiscal 21. So those are just some of the concerns that I have. We have figured out right from the beginning of this that the new position we had on the table would be off the table, and we fully understand that. We're not looking to otherwise increase the budget, but I am looking to be able to continue the transportation and the meals program. I think are the two most essential programs that we provide to the most critical members of our population.
So Linda, I have a question for you about that.
Sure.
Have you coordinated or talked to the school department in any way? Because obviously they're running the basically their nutrition program for kids, and to the extent that we might be able to leverage, do both from one and have the van drivers, for example, pick up the meals from there, have them prepare the meals for you or something like that.
I know some meals are being provided from seniors on other days from the school. The thing that we're doing is we're doing hot meals. And the reason we do that is that most of the people we're providing to don't really have the ability to prepare hot meals for themselves. So these are people that either have lost a caregiver that was providing it for them because of the current situation, or they were coming to the senior center, that we were bringing them to the senior center. So we were very well aware that those were really oftentimes the only really hot meals that they were getting in the course of the week, other than perhaps making themselves a cup of soup or something to that nature.
Okay. Well, what I would say is obviously, to the extent that you can, even if there's no, I say this all the time, right? You should, even if it turns out that there's no overlap or no synergy there, you definitely should be, reach out to the school department and talk, because there may be other ways that they can either facilitate getting, more meals or coordinating deliveries or something like that, where there might be an opportunity to not just cost savings, but deliver better, value to our seniors in a sense, get them more meals or something like that. So I'd strongly encourage you just to reach out and find out from them whether there's an opportunity there. The other thing I would say is, from the budget standpoint, it would be very helpful if you could get us, put down virtual pen to paper, so to speak, and give us some numbers on how this is, what your COVID response basically is doing to these numbers. Like, what is it? How much are you spending more per week? What are you spending on, right? Because two reasons. One is because I'm sure you're already doing this. If you're giving it to Sharon, she's going to be carving it out as COVID-related expenses. But also because, this is, again, to the point we made earlier about having the ability to continue COVID-related responses into FY21, we're going to want to know how much money needs to be put aside for potentially continuing some of these activities next fiscal year.
But Ken, it's Sue again. For Linda's purpose, I mean, we already had van drivers. They were taking seniors to doctor's appointments, to the grocery store, et cetera. And so they're still doing the driving, maybe not with the senior, maybe not taking the seniors from their home to the senior center. Now it's taking the meal from the senior center to the home. So is some of the costs, I don't know, will be identifiable because they're doing the same thing. We're still making the meals, so those costs are still the same. Now, instead of going one way, home to senior center, we're going senior center to the home to deliver those. So
but in the normal,
I know if it, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, in the normal course of events, though, the revenue that pays for those drivers, according to what Linda was saying, right? The revenue, there's revenue behind that's paying that that's not there anymore, right? So
agreed. There's going to be some things
that I don't care which direction they're going in. It's that the revenue's not there, so the town has to make up that piece. Right? So
it's the identifiable pieces that are different that she should be quantifying. Got it. Okay. Sorry. I just want to make sure we're clear.
Yeah. Now just
and the other question I had for her.
Okay.
Who at the school is running the lunch program that she should connect with? Because I just want to make sure we have a direct person that she can reach out to.
Keith Boudet.
Okay.
Keith Boudet.
Yeah. Because he'll be obviously coordinating. He's coordinating the financial side, and he'll know everything about what they're doing with the cafeteria staff there. And part of the reason I mentioned that, by the way, is not just cost synergy. It's also because if they're opening the cafeteria and preparing these meals, and they have cafeteria staff doing that, right? There may be an opportunity to have them, we're in this situation where some people are getting paid for doing a reduced amount of work because the situation has changed, right? Mm-hmm. So if there's capacity in our employment base, so that may be a case where we can say, hey, cafeteria staff has bandwidth because they're not feeding 1,000 kids lunches every day. So maybe we can have them do something, as you said, provide more hot meals for a senior, or do something like that to leverage the fact that they're on the payroll and they're being underutilized.
Okay.
So, okay. And obviously, the one thing I was going to ask you about the van is, how is that operating now, in the sense that, seniors obviously being the vulnerable population for this illness?
So it's multifaceted. So first of all, We screen anyone looking for a ride to see what it is and is there some other way that we can meet that need. So in some cases, our drivers are actually going to the pharmacy to pick up prescriptions, for example. So the downside of that is we don't get the fare. The fare is only if we have the passenger on the bus, but we're still doing things like that. We've connected people to the food pantry, like I said, and other resources in terms of getting additional food in the house without them having to go to the grocery store. But if somebody really insists, it's also still their right. So we're also working with guidelines under the MWRTA. So we're asking anyone on our vehicles to be wearing a mask at all times, which will include the driver. We also are being asked to not transport more than 3 individuals at any one time. Right now, that's not an issue because our numbers are just not there. But once we start getting one truly going to the grocery stores, for example, if we had to do that reduced number still on the bus, that would require us to do more trips than we would normally do to the grocery store to accommodate this 15 or so people that might have to go grocery shopping in a given week. Mm. So instead of 2 trips, that might end up being 5 trips.
Right.
And then our drivers are also.
When you said we don't get the fare, Linda,
the fare,
when you said that they don't get the fare, what does from whom? Who does that come from?
This is from the client. So the client,
oh, okay.
The MWRTA. So when you're booking a ride with us normally, you contact the Metro Regional Transit Authority. Everybody that rides has a fare account set up with them. When their ride is taken, that money is deducted from their account. If they're not on the bus, if we're still doing the same thing but not involving the person on the bus, we're not getting any fare. So that's part of our budget. Also, when we transport somebody under the American with Disabilities Act, we get $14 a trip. So we're getting much fewer of those. So that's the other piece. So there's our base 34, I don't have the number right in front of me, that we get every month from the MWRTA. The rest of that is the money that we get from the fares and the money we get from the ADA ridership. And that's the monies that have disappeared, essentially. We're getting a small amount of fares.
Now, has the MWRTA in any way considered, not that I'm seeking revenue, but I'm just saying, like, to me, if I get on an MWRTA van and you take me to the drugstore so I can get my prescription, versus you driving yourself, the van going to the drugstore by themselves, getting the prescription, driving back to me, that's a ride. Whether or not I'm on the bus, that ride was made for me, right? Mm-hmm. So I personally would not have a problem paying for that in a sense, right? If you came to me and said, hey, look, we would take you to the drugstore, but now we can't do that because of the COVID virus, so we'll get it for you, then I'd say, fine, then deduct my fare because you're still doing the trip, for even though I'm not on the bus. So, I mean, is MWRTA even looking at that? Because we may be in this situation for quite a long time, especially with that population.
They're certainly aware of that. And specifically talked about that, but they're also have the concerns on their end too with funding, just like everybody else. Is their ridership across the board is way down, and looking for income. I'm certainly happy to reach out to them.
Yeah.
More
so, I mean, I'm just saying that it's one of these things where, mm-hmm. Certainly in the short term, we want to do everything we can to support our seniors during this difficult time. But at the same time, if the quote new normal is going to require a change to what we've done in the past that may go on for a long time, we kind of what we were just talking about with the budget, right? Things will have to change that may change for quite a while. And those things you can't just continually treat as a crisis. You can't say, okay, from now on, we're going to have social distancing requirements for the next 2 years and ridership levels that are, we then have to start saying, how do we adapt to it? Not just, we just keep using an inefficient method, so.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay. So anybody have anything else for, on the seniors for Linda? Okay, if not, then you're free to go, Linda, unless you have nothing better to do while you're on confinement. While we're all on.
I've been listening to you I've been listening to you all for the last month. So
that's is it really that? Are you that bored on your stay-at-home order that you feel compelled to listen to us?
Well, I like to try to stay up on what's going on and being prepared.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So. Okay, so Is there anything else that anybody wanted to discuss tonight? I think I hit the main points. Let me just double check my notes. I think I talked about all the things I want to talk about. Yep. So I see Sue raising her hand. So
No, go ahead,
Sue.
Tim. Let Tim can go first.
No,
Okay, Tim can go first because he's in the Greg Brady box on my screen. So
I was just trying to get your attention on Susan so you didn't miss her.
oh, so I saw
I do.
Sue.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Well, you were looking down, so Tim was being very helpful. So I read on the town website that there is about the power supply program, the aggregation program, that I think there was something that was established in 2015, and it's. And I was wondering if there was any potential impact, depending on what happens with the comments, to our budgets. I didn't know anything about it, and I haven't really digested the whole memo yet, but I just wasn't sure if it's something that we should be thinking about at all.
Okay, so what are you saying? It's on the town. I just want to look at what you're talking about here.
Yep, it's on the town website. Let me see. I actually pulled it up before. It's a public review and comment on the town's revised community choice power supply program aggregation plan from it was back in 2015.
Right.
And then there's a public review and comment period. And so I just wasn't sure. I didn't know anything about it from. Yeah, this is well, I know what it is, right? But it's basically, it's the electricity aggregation program, right? Where the town negotiates bulk electricity purchase for town residents. You're free to choose whoever you want for your electricity supplier, right? And so the town enters into a contract that basically says that if you don't opt out, you'll get the town's contract, which is generally a lower rate than what you would pay on your own to through Eversource or something like that, right? Doesn't mean you can't. I mean, for all I know, I haven't done the research. For all I know, you get better rates, but I'm saying the default rate that you would get would generally be higher. So it's kind of just a volume purchase agreement, right? Okay.
I know that as part of that, you have to have these public hearings and public comments. So my guess is that the contract is coming up for some kind of regular renewal, and so they're just going through the normal comment period. I'll take a look further, but I don't think there's anything like that's being done because they're radically changing the program. I think it's just that the contract's up for renewal and they have to go through this process of public comment every time they renew it.
And I presume the town buildings would opt into this as well?
Yes, although, and this is something why I said I'll follow up a little bit on it. As you know, the town has been pursuing a solar farm at the old landfill, right? I do know that work is not work in terms of construction. I'm saying that the work in terms of moving that process forward is still ongoing, right? The town, I was part of the group of people that reviewed the proposals and, selected a vendor and so forth and so on. So that aspect of things is still moving forward. So whether that in the end ties into the town buildings or even the town's aggregation, because for all I know, that could be tied into our next contract in terms of benefiting from the fact that we're going to have this solar farm going online sometime next year. So.
Okay. And then the only other question I have is just with the oil prices, I know we lock in, and I don't know if the current pricing has anything to do with what we can lock into, but is someone looking into that?
Yes. Obviously the biggest, the town buys through we have the motor vehicle fuels budget, and obviously the schools have a big fuel budget for the buses. That's obviously somewhere where they're saving a lot of money right now because the buses aren't running. When we talked to the schools last time, they had mentioned that yes, they're saving money because they're not running the buses, but at the same time they have minimum purchase contracts. So and they obviously have to keep the schools, they're running it more efficiently, but they still have to have the heat on type of things. But that was specifically mentioned to both those groups to say, hey, can we take advantage of the fact that prices are the way they are and lock in contracts at current rates and things like that. So they're both last I talked to both Jeff and Keith, they were both looking into whether we could take advantage of the price tip. So, okay, now Chief Cassidy, I see, has joined us. So, and he's also raised his hand, which gives me the, tells me he wants to say something, but I also wanted to get the update from him on our response. So Chief Cassidy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity. Sorry I'm late. I was over at the Board of Health. In terms of our numbers, with 2 additional cases received this evening, we're now up to 32 positive cases. We've had 16 who have cleared. We have 1 fatality, which leaves us with 15 active cases at this time. Our current PPE inventory is good, and we'll definitely be able to ride out the surge and the remainder of the cases. And when I was at the Board of Health meeting a few minutes ago, they just voted to make face coverings mandatory in the town of Holliston when you go into an establishment, if you are working at an establishment, or if you are in a public space where you are not likely to be able to maintain physical distancing.
Okay, that's good. So I presume that that's going to be something published on the town's website tomorrow.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the reason that I had raised my hand was because when you were talking about energy aggregation and the town buildings, we have solar on arrays on the top of the central fire station. And so we do not participate in the aggregation because our agreement is through the owner of the solar array that we are allowing to use our roof for.
Yeah. So, okay. So in terms of budget, Chief, do we have any new or unknown expenses last week related to the response?
We're still getting in some of the PPE that was ordered in February and March. So I did see another invoice for $600 worth of N95 masks, but we don't have any major expenses coming up. Most everything was front loaded a month ago, and now we're just seeing things trickle in. So no major expenses anticipated.
Okay, good. Okay, anybody else have any questions for the chief?
Sorry for probably a dumb question, but is there going to be some clarity around what we mean by not able to publicly distance? Like, what does that actually mean? Does that mean on the trail you need a mask? Does that mean something else?
Sure. There's some specific language that they've voted, which was based on something that had been enacted by the city of Somerville. But yeah, they specifically call out places like the rail trail and when you're biking and when you're walking on a sidewalk. Obviously, if you're in your backyard, we're not going to mandate that you have face covering on. But if you're in a public space where you are likely to encounter someone else and could not maintain physical distancing, then you are both supposed to be wearing face coverings.
Perfect.
So I would presume it's something like walking down the street would be okay because you can obviously distance easily when you're walking down the street.
Not necessarily. The example that I gave was you're walking down the street and then all of a sudden your neighbor who hasn't seen you for 6 weeks because they've been inside their home sees that you're out walking and they pull up alongside of you in their car and they start to have a conversation with you. Now, although you thought that you were going to be able to distance yourself, they backed you into a corner. Except
that you could still distance, right? I mean, if okay, I'm just curious because I'm just saying, like, if you're exercising or walking, I went walking this weekend, for example, and I passed many people, but everybody was distancing. Like when they saw me coming, they'd cross the street or we'd walk, make sure we passed far enough apart. Maybe it's because I smelled or something. I don't know, but I'm just saying that. Right. But I was just saying, like, I would presume that wouldn't necessarily be a danger,
Bring your mask.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Sparrow.
Chief, thank you for the update. I heard you, I guess it was last night, and you were talking about having this meeting. Is there you had mentioned about possibly having fines attached. Are there fines, or how is this being this distancing being enforced, and when does it go into effect?
So the board voted it to go into effect immediately. So that will be a matter of once they can communicate this out to the public tomorrow, it will start to be enforceable. However, the board, as well as my board, did not have an appetite for levying fines. And so at this current iteration of the policy that they voted this evening, the Board of Health will approach this as an educational opportunity, and it is not their intention to immediately start fining people.
Are they the ones enforcing it, or is it going to be like police or?
So the way the public health regulations read, because this is a Board of Health order, it is enforceable by the Board of Health or the local or state police.
Yeah, we do need revenue, so
I was going to say, make the fine $1.5 million when we have no budget hole as soon as you catch somebody. Okay?
So a lot of the bullet points of what they adopted, they were trying to address two things. First of all, there are a lot of places like the rail trail and other recreation locations where people are not able to physically distance and tend to congregate. And so that was addressing individuals in the public. But the other large focus of this policy that they adopted tonight was really to address the essential businesses. And although there are a lot of essential businesses where people are wearing face coverings inside the business or when people are going in as consumers, there are still some businesses where folks have not been doing that. And so this is putting businesses on notice that they have a requirement to protect their employees as well as any customer, member of the public who may be coming into that essential business during this time. So if they were down the road to start to find someone because they found them to be consistently and flagrantly disobeying this order, then it would be the businesses that would be fined. It is not their intention to fine Ken while he's out on his walk and everyone moves to the other side of the street.
I will say that this weekend we ran out of options, and my wife was out and she doing an errand to pick up some food, and went to one of the Ashland fast food restaurants, and they were not wearing masks inside, and that was a little disconcerting. So this is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, that's part of what played into to them adopting this tonight, is because they are hearing these anecdotes about individual businesses where folks go to pick up takeout and they're dismayed that no one who either prepared their food or is serving them their food is wearing a face covering. So this hopefully will address that concern. And again, the intent of how they're going to enforce this and roll this out is going to be an educational opportunity to just remind the business owners that they have an obligation to protect their employees as well as the public. And they have the right to refuse service to somebody who shows up who's not wearing a face covering. But you really only have the standing to do that if every one of your employees is also wearing a face covering at the time.
Right. Okay.
Chief, are any first responders? I think you mentioned one person may have been sick last week. Are any other first responders impacted by the virus?
Yes.
Yeah, and I will just caution that when it comes to public safety officials, we don't want to discuss not only individuals, but also how that may or may not be impacting public safety. So,
correct. That would be executive session material. I can affirm that we do have town employees who have tested positive at this point.
Right, and to be honest with you, it's not something we need to worry about anyway, right? It's only becomes a matter for us from the financial standpoint. So.
Yeah, apologize. Sorry.
But just out of curiosity, would a public health official who doesn't, or anybody, a town employee who does not live in Holliston but test positive, would they be in our count?
It would not. Our count only includes residents. We are keeping a separate tally of employees that we are aware of, both town employees as well as employees of businesses in town that we're aware of. But With regards to budgetary impact, to the chairman's point, any of the impacted departments have contingency plans to ensure service delivery without impacting other issues.
And obviously, if that ended up becoming such an issue that they needed additional money, as soon as they became aware that it was going to run over, they would come to us, and we could meet in executive session or however to figure out how to fund it.
Correct.
Yes, they all know the current environment that we're operating in. They know the restrictions on spending additional money, but they also know that if they run into a jam, that they will need to come to you and their appointing authority.
But there are many positions in town where the money needs to be spent regardless. So,
Yeah. So, okay. Any other, Ben, were you raising your hand? Yep. Go ahead.
Yes. Chief, you might have talked about this before, but I jogged my memory hearing Linda from the Senior Center talking. The expenses that you've been tracking for the COVID, these are all departments, correct?
I would like to be able to tell you that they are all departments, although it was expressed that we would like for me to be able to track all departments. Not everyone is reporting into me, but everyone, if it's a COVID-related expense, does have the ability to code that on their invoice when they submit it to payment, to Sharon for payment. So I can go in and I can run a report and find anything that may have been COVID related that an individual department didn't report to me.
So that led to my second question, is basically, so are you being notified directly about expenses, or are you getting information from Sharon? It sounds like you're kind of getting both in effect because of what how people are coding invoices when Sharon pays them.
Yeah, it's a combination. They have to be coded for Sharon's purposes, and that will also help us later on if or when we seek reimbursement under the federal declaration. Some departments are coming to me because they're wondering, would this be an appropriate purchase? Do you think that it's something that might be reimbursable? And so they've run certain expenses by me, and then others have been very, very open and shared all of their actual expenses with me. So it's a combination. Again, I'm not approving school department expenses, but early on, Brad did share with me some of the big expenses that they had.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Anybody have anything else for the chief? Okay. Anybody have anything else they want to bring up before we close for tonight? Okay. Then if hearing nothing, I will entertain the motion.
Motion to adjourn.
Do I have a second?
Second.
So
Go ahead. Win.
Okay, so I guess that's, we'll give the second to Suzanne. So, okay, so that concludes the,
we have to vote.
oh, we got to take the vote first, right? I'm so used to saying that we don't have debate, that maybe screwed me up there. So, okay, it's not subject to debate, so we'll proceed to vote. This must be a roll call vote, so I'll go through the group here. So, Mr. Alfred?
Yes.
Mr. Maxwell?
Yes.
Ms. Zemer?
Yes.
Ms. Nersessian? Ms. Nersessian?
Oh, yep. Sorry, I was
Okay,
on
Mr.
mute.
Murphy?
Yes.
Mr. Sparrow?
Yes.
Okay, now that concludes the Tuesday, April 28th meeting of the Finance Committee. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Kendi, you didn't vote.
Oh, yes, of course I vote aye. That goes without saying, but I'll say it just for the record. Okay, so thank you for joining us this evening. As you heard, we'll be meeting weekly, at least as necessary to deal with the ongoing budget situation. But for tonight, we're done. So thank you and good night.